Good afternoon. My name is Michael Taylor. I'm Senior Director for Public Affairs at Kellen, and I want to welcome you all today to this joint webinar presented to you by Kellen and Bracewell. Let me just mention a couple of items before we get started. First of all, we will be recording the webinar, and we are going to be making the slides available. So we encourage you not to worry about taking notes, but just absorb as much of the presentation as possible. Please do submit questions through the GoToWebinar, and there is the question box, and I would encourage you to submit those as they come to you and anytime throughout the presentation. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. We can also follow up with participants on the questions that we don't get to as soon as possible. Now let me turn it over to Paul Nathanson, who's Senior Principal for the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell.
Thanks, Michael, and welcome everybody to this webinar. We're very excited to be able to present this information to you. I will be very short because we only have about an hour. We have a lot of information to present to you. As Michael said, I'm with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, which is we're a law firm. I work in the government relations section and do strategic communications. We have assembled a multidisciplinary task force of our legal side, our government relations, and our strategic communications side on the COVID-19 issue, and we're happy to share our knowledge with you. This just continues a long 10-year partnership we've had with Kellen, where we partner on government relations, strategic communications, message development. They have been a great assistance to our clients in the past, and I think we have played the same role with their clients. Today from Bracewell, we have Josh Zive, who's a senior principal at Bracewell in the Policy Resolution Group. We have Liam Donovan, who's also in the Policy Resolution Group, and then we have Dave Shargell, who is a partner on the law firm side at Bracewell. So with that, I turn it over to Josh.
Hi, I have, like Paul said, we at Bracewell have been confronting this from all of the angles because it has both the political communications and legal aspects. I get the easy part of this job, which is talking about the things that you all already understand. But we wanted to kind of give you a framework for how this relief effort is playing out. So starting with kind of where we are, these are the obvious things that we're all encountering, but this is the context that the relief occurs in. And that is that we're at about 95% of the population that are under some form of lockdown right now. That is a stunning and unprecedented number, as everyone here knows. But what's important to keep in mind, and this is why we wanted to set this in the context as we turn to the next slide, is that the state policies vary significantly, right? So from at a broad level, virtually everybody has some form of a lockdown. And as you start to drill down a little bit more, you start to see the variations. First, while there's still a few, as marked by the gray states, that are pure holdouts, there are differentiations even between the states. There are a couple of states that have business closure only, and then the most states have safe at home and business closure both. But even that those differentiations fail to capture the way that really state and locals can drive this part of the process. And that's what we're saying, is that to understand at an outset, there is the state and locals are controlling a vast majority of that. So as we get to the next slide, we dig down even deeper into this, which is that when you start looking county by county, you see even more variations and even more question marks, right? We literally don't know what many of the counties in the country are doing. They've not made formal declarations. Then you've got some with emergency declarations, some with both emergency declarations and business closures, and some with only business closures. But it's created this patchwork at the state and local level that has been confusing and in many ways frustrating for people like the people on this call. And that's why, you go to the next slide, at this stage of it, when we're talking not the federal response, but really how you deal with your workforces, what we're seeing is a broad amount of discretion. Because overall, U.S. law delegates most of these questions to cities, counties, and states. which is why, as we talk about the federal relief effort, it's important to draw a line here. Most of the things that people are in their day-to-day lives reaching as obstacles related to COVID relief, which is really more COVID-19 prevention, are the function of cities, counties, and states. And that's where the determinations are coming from. Now, that is not to say, however, that the federal government has no role in this process. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA or CISA, they've been promulgating updated guidance that they provide to states and locals about what they consider essential employees. But this is a voluntary definition. So while working through CISA can be helpful, some states go further, some states don't go as far. Go to the next slide. And so, we do recommend, as tracking the state and local issues, to follow two things. First, you have to be carefully monitoring whatever the state, local, and county regulations that are coming out, because you cannot depend upon the federal government for leadership on those closure issues. But you should be consulting the types of guidance you can find on the CISA webpage, and that they're producing regularly, which is their updated guidance on what is essential and what is essential, particularly in the context of critical infrastructure. Pay attention to those things because they are informing the state and local issues, but ultimately on the closure issues, you're dealing with the state and local. That's why the majority of our presentation on federal issues are going to turn on what the relief programs are. So as we go to the next slide, I'm going to turn this over to Liam Donovan. Liam is really kind of one of the foremost experts, and as you can develop on what this relief program has been at the federal level. He's been involved since day one, and he'll lay out the structure of how the federal government has attempted to really kind of get involved in leading the relief effort. Liam?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think that's a good setup, a good place to start, because until we kind of acknowledge the broader, shutdown, timeout in the economy more broadly, we can't really tackle the congressional response. And we're going to go through a lot of things here, so I'd remind you that you can submit questions throughout the talk, and we'll get to them and try to maybe work through them as we're talking about these things. But I really like this slide because it lays out in just sort of a broad view of how Congress and its response has shifted over time. And what's remarkable to me is looking at this, you can see the first one, phase one, which seems like ancient history at that point, it was just about a month ago. But these three major pieces of law, over $2.5 trillion in assistance, not including the additional trillions that the Fed just announced today in relief, all was enacted within 3 weeks, between the 6th of March and the 27th of March. And if you remember, these were three phases of legislation that sort of crested upon one another because the situation was escalating very, very quickly. And with phase one, I look at that as kind of the Band-Aid or the Z-Pack for this situation. It was really focused on, a little bit of HHS funding, it was supplemental appropriations. And then by the time they did that, they sort of started to realize, okay, maybe this isn't a global problem, this is a U.S. problem, and we have to deal with the fact that it's going to be here on our shores very soon. That moved to phase two, which was really, I'd look at it as kind of like a stent to our safety net in the terms of realizing that workers were going to be sick with this, that they were going to be out tending to their families, and having to build out something within the structure of our employment law, a way for people to take advantage of that. And so that was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That almost collided with phase three, because by the time they were done with phase two, you were getting the shutdown orders, you were getting the fact that, holy cow, this is going to be a true pandemic. And they almost collided to the point where they became one package. By that point, there were multiple members of the House that were actually sick. The House did not stick around, so they left the Senate to do the work of phase three, which they basically wrote themselves and sort of handed over to the House. The Senate bill, phase three, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about, is by far the broadest, most comprehensive package. This was the sort of induced economic coma, and trying to figure out how we get the economy, how do we get families, how do we get businesses through this period. I think at that time, it wasn't clear how long that was going to be, and they tried to sort of inject as much liquidity and relief in this package as possible, because they know they won't be back in a position to legislate on a large scale for some time. Phase four, that has come to mean different things over time, because it is really a moving target. And I think it was a different discussion this time last week than it is even now. I think you've had 2 straight weeks of just devastating jobs numbers that have really changed the tone of the conversation. And so I think when we talk about phase 4 or future phases, we're really talking about 2 things. Number one, there was an effort on the Senate floor today to just throw a little bit more money at existing programs. The Democrats have countered the Republican plan with more funding of their own within the context of sort of the framework of phase 3, and the House has announced when they do come back, potentially at the end of April, they want to work on what they call CARES 2. So really that's still focused in the kind of emergency relief kind of vein. More broadly, you'll hear talk of other things like when it's time to come back to work and put the economy back to work. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I think that's important is, when we talk about phase 4, really that's just anything out in the future, and it's a complex and sort of fluid situation there. Anna, you can go on to the next slide. It's really just a really small $8.3 billion. It sounded like a lot at the time, but has obviously since been dwarfed. A lot of things related to the State Department, because again, this was a global crisis that was maybe going to come to our shores, but not necessarily to the extent that it ultimately has become. Next slide, please. Phase 2, I think, is important because it's actually only been implemented for the last week, and it was something because the crisis was escalating so quickly that I don't know that a lot of people and small businesses in particular appreciated was coming. Some of this was related to what you see on this slide, related to food and nutrition programs, a lot of the social safety net issues, some of the healthcare response. But the next slide shows you, I think, what's most important about this, which is 2 pieces related to paid leave. One is changing the existing FMLA policies. Instead of being, something that you qualify over a long-term period and you can take unpaid leave, it actually created a COVID-related 10-week leave program on the back end of your 12 weeks of protected FMLA leave. It would create leave whereby you could be paid at 2/3 of your regular rate of pay. That's capped at $200 a day, 50 days, so $10,000 in aggregate. That's set to terminate at the end of the year, but I think with all these programs, it's just hard to say. I think these are programs that Democrats have been working on for some time, so I don't know that they'll necessarily just disappear overnight. That's for the FMLA piece. On the next slide, you'll see there's actually also an emergency paid sick leave piece, which is for the worker themselves. That is for 10 days of paid sick leave, so really kind of 2 work weeks at their full wages, capped at $511 per day. Again, that's 10 days, so $110 in aggregate. There's lots of guidance, lots of implementation rules on this that have been coming in the last 10 days or so. I'd recommend going and checking those out. But big picture, this at the time was an acknowledgement that people are going to be out sick. People are going to be out tending to sick family members. We need to do something building around the existing workplace to allow for that. Now, that's a huge mandate on employers with fewer than 500 employees. Typically, they're the ones accepted from these mandates. I think the logic of the law was the bigger guys have paid sick leave programs. We'll let them do this, but we need to provide something for half of the economy or half of the private employment that works for smaller companies. What they did to sort of hold these companies harmless is, thank you. So a tax credit, hypothetically, or at least sort of theoretically, the idea is to make it from a cash flow standpoint, hold the employer so that you can claim a tax credit against the employer share of the payroll tax for these same amounts. So, it sounds like a lot. You're suddenly on the hook for these big paid leave mandates on top of what you've been bring to your employers or to your employees, but suddenly you have these new mandates. Well, there's this relief for you. There's tax credits available, and so again, I'd point you to the guidance there. So going to phase 3, and I think this is the most important thing that people need to understand for our purposes today. Just big picture in terms of what this bill did. I think the single biggest piece, if you look at it just from a revenue standpoint, is tax provisions, and what they meant to do with the tax piece. We'll talk a little bit more about it. Was do things that could immediately inject some cash and sort of relief to companies who can go back and amend prior year's returns against losses, things related to accelerated refunds, anything to inject more money into companies, allow them to make payroll. Speaking of payroll, I think the other piece of this is this is direct payment to individuals. That's like the $1,200 checks and whatnot. But also, I think unemployment is the biggest key there, because there's a huge plus up in unemployment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's emergency funding for hospitals, about 15% of the bill, so $350 billion. The Paycheck Protection Act, which is going to be a big point of interest. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on that. I will gladly hand them off to my colleague, Dave Shargel. $500 billion in exchange stabilization funds, which is really much bigger than $500 billion. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that is going to be the Treasury and Fed program to create a much bigger lending facility to allow companies that don't qualify for the Paycheck Protection Program to also benefit from loans. Next slide. I think this is a good slide that looks at how these all interact. There was a lot of caveats built into this law, so you couldn't, quote unquote, double dip. So that, let's say you are taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program that we'll talk about a little bit later. You can't take the Employee Retention Credit, which is a new program that they put in to encourage people to, as it says, retain employees. If you use the Paycheck Protection Program and have loans forgiven through that, you can't use the payroll deferral, payroll tax deferral provisions which are in there. You can't do both the economic stabilization loans and paycheck protection loans. There's a caveat to that we'll get to later. So these interact in interesting ways, and we'll get into that a little bit more, or answer any questions you might have there. I would note that we don't talk a lot about this later, but the EIDL loans, the economic injury loans, you can get both paycheck protection loans and economic injury loans as long as they're not used for the exact same thing. So that's something that I would flag as people are looking at what programs they can take advantage of. Next slide, please. So again, the individual relief piece, it's still, the 9th of April. We haven't seen those checks hit yet. I think we're supposed to see those in the week or two to come. That's the $1,200 checks for individuals, $500 per dependent child. That's for most taxpayers. It starts to recede as you get above the $75,000 individual limit. But we have a delay of all the tax filing deadlines, and it's now moved out to July 15th as well. You can tap retirement funds without penalty. There's some things to be done with charitable contributions to make sure that people are able to, even non-itemizers are able to deduct above the line. It loosens restrictions that are typically there for eliminating contributions as well. Next slide. And I will shortly hand it over to Dave here because he can speak to this at length. But big picture, small businesses were really a core component of what Congress was trying to provide relief to here. And it was the most bipartisan part of the bill. It was the one that was most fully baked early on. And the centerpiece of that is the Paycheck Protection Program that I'll allow Dave to talk about. But it also did a few things like covering 6 months of payments for existing SBA loans. That was another $17 billion. It also, I mentioned those EIDL loans. There's $10 billion set aside for emergency grants, that if you apply for an EIDL loan, you automatically get $10,000 just for applying. You don't even have to be approved. There was a lot to say about the PPP, and you've been hearing a lot about it on the news, I'm sure. So I will hand it over to Dave Shargel, who is a partner in the firm and is also one of the leaders spearheading our firm-wide COVID task force, has really done a great job, and is the guy I turn to with all my questions. So I'll let you ask questions of him as well. And Dave, take it away.
Thanks, Liam. So as Liam mentioned, the Paycheck Protection Program aspect of the Phase 3 legislation has probably gotten some of the most attention. It provides $349 billion to small businesses to help them maintain their employees or retain their employees and maintain pre-pandemic levels of payroll. So on this slide, what do we mean when we say a small business? It's businesses up to 500 employees that were in existence as of February 15th. Now, with a lot of the payroll protection program rules and regulations, the devil is very much in the details, and that includes the way that we count employees for purposes of determining qualification. And I'll address that in a few minutes, but I just want to flag it because it's not as simple as just saying 500 employees. But it's important to note that the program really expands the definition of eligible employers to companies that would not typically have been qualified for SBA loans, and those include nonprofits and religious organizations. How much relief is available? The amount of the loan is dependent upon a business's payroll costs. And so it's based on an average of the prior 12 months payroll costs multiplied by 2.5. And that is the amount of the loan, which is capped at $10 million. The loan proceeds can be used to continue to pay payroll costs, as well as for interest payments, rent payments, and utilities. But there's a big caveat here, which is that for the forgiveness aspect of the loan, in order for the loan to be forgiven, which we'll get to in a few slides, the focus really needs to be on the payroll costs. Let's go to the next slide. So how do businesses qualify for a Paycheck Protection Program loan? Well, the SBA has really placed a lot of the burden on qualification on the borrowers, which is a little bit atypical because the lenders aren't as much involved in the process of determining whether the borrower, is qualified. So when borrowers fill out the loan application, it's the borrowers who will need to attest that they're qualified for the loan, at least in the first instance. So what does that mean here? The first thing that borrowers need to certify is that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. So for a lot of businesses, restaurants, for example, that's going to be a very easy certification to make because there's been a clear demarcation and a drop off in business as a direct result of the pandemic. But for other businesses, this will certainly require a bit of a more complicated analysis into the business conditions. Businesses also have to certify that the borrower is generally eligible to receive the loan, and that includes that the borrower meets the size tests, the 500 employee test that I mentioned earlier. A large part of that analysis requires consideration of the relationship between the business and any affiliates. So if a company is affiliated with another one, which is a question that generally turns on ownership and control, the employees of the affiliate company also need to be counted. This has created a lot of questions and a lot of confusion about whether a business is eligible. So for example, if your business has 200 employees, but an affiliated entity that owns or controls your business has 1,000 employees, it's possible that those employees will need to be counted together, taking you out of eligibility. There are exceptions, though, to the affiliation rule for the purposes of the Paycheck Protection Program. Those include hotels and restaurants, religious organizations, and franchises. A business also needs to certify that it doesn't fall within a list of businesses that are prohibited from receiving SBA loans. Those include banks and investment companies and other businesses whose stock and trade is in money. It also includes passive businesses. An example would be a company that invests in real estate and just leases property to tenants. That would be a passive business that under existing SBA guidance would be ineligible. And of course, businesses that are engaged in illegal activity would be ineligible. One example that the SBA provides is marijuana dispensaries, because that's still illegal under federal law, although I hear that they are doing quite well. Let's go to the next slide. So how is the loan amount determined? The loan amount is, as I mentioned, based on 2.5 months of payroll costs, and that includes salaries, compensation, benefits, and state and local taxes. But payroll costs for purposes of calculating a loan do not include some important items, which is, again, an issue that has caused a lot of confusion and questions. One being that payroll costs do not include compensation over $100,000 a year. So for employees who make $100,000 or more, their average monthly payroll would be capped at $8,333. Payroll costs also don't include federal withholding tax, FICA, and RRA withholding. Sick leave, family leave wages aren't included. And then also compensation paid to independent contractors is not included in the calculation of payroll costs under SBA guidance, although this has created some confusion because there are regional SBA offices that have provided opposite guidance, saying that employees who are paid by 1099 are included. So it's, again, the devil's in the details. Let's go to the next slide. So these are the loan terms. For loans under the Paycheck Protection Program, the interest rate is 1%, maturity of 2 years. First payment can be deferred for 6 months, and the loans are 100% guaranteed by the SBA. And unlike more standard SBA loans, there's no collateral requirement, there's no requirement for personal guarantees, and there are no borrower fees payable to the SBA. That is all if the loan isn't forgiven. So let's go to the next slide and talk about forgiveness. So you might have heard some of these small business loans characterized as grants, and that could be true because there is a forgiveness aspect. If the loan funds are spent on allowable expenses, it is possible that the entire amount of the loan will be forgiven. But forgiveness is directly correlated to maintaining payroll and maintaining salaries. So if a business takes a loan but lays off half of its workforce or reduces compensation past a certain threshold, the forgiveness will be lowered proportionally. Applications for these SBA loans began processing last Friday on April 3rd. And for independent contractors and self-employed individuals, they can begin applying on April 10th. And finally, what's the catch? As Liam mentioned, the funds are limited, although Congress is working to increase the amount of available funds if necessary. And then, of course, as we mentioned, that if any amount of the debt is forgiven, there's no longer eligibility for the retention tax credit. Liam, do you want to take the next slide? I'm catching up with some questions, but perhaps we could start with these and then we can address questions.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So I'll address one because I know it's come up a couple times, and there was a slide in there that relates to some of the interactions among the programs, particularly with PPP, because it interacts with a lot of these things. And there was a question about whether you could collect unemployment and also Paycheck Protection Program. The connection there is that the forgiveness for the loan, as Dave mentioned, is reduced if you put workers on unemployment. So the interaction there is more related to keeping people on payroll versus putting them on UI. There's no restriction between those otherwise, and you can absolutely get the family rebates, the $1,200 checks and UI. That is perfectly permissible, and you'll get this deck when it goes back around. So don't worry about that. Dave, thanks for turning it back over. I think the small business piece, the reason that we can say the most about that is because that's what we know the most about. That's what Congress spent the most time on in terms of being most prescripted on, and it was also the first thing that Treasury turned to because it was built sort of piggybacking on an existing system of SBA loan programs and lenders. The more opaque part of the bill was this called the exchange stabilization, and part of that about was set aside for specific industry relief. That was, you'll hear about the airline bailouts. About $29 billion of that was to airline air carriers and cargo carriers. Another $17 billion went quote unquote national security companies. I think that was with an eye toward aerospace firms and people that were hit hard, also related to aviation. But the rest, about $454 billion, is just to facilitate loans across the economy. And because it was that sort of open.
Okay, I guess I'm back here. My phone died. I apologize for that. So I'm not quite sure where I left it, but I'll say the Exchange Stabilization Fund is the $454 billion that the Treasury Department is working with the Federal Reserve on, and we're starting to get more details on that, but the oversight requirements are below. That is a significant piece of it and one of the biggest hangups when it came to getting it through Congress. Anya, can you go to the next slide? So The Main Street Business Lending Program is mentioned in the Act, and it's also been mentioned in Federal Reserve releases, and it's just meant to support lending to eligible small and medium-sized businesses. That was about all we knew until I'll get to the next slide, but we found out more today. The mid-size lending program is also laid out in the statute, but it doesn't say that the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Secretary has to create this. It says they must endeavor to create it. And so it laid out sort of guidelines that they needed to subscribe to, and it was meant to go to businesses between 500 and 10,000 employees, and it laid out very specific things: a maximum interest rate of 2%, very specific certifications with respect to employee retention, specific things related to labor neutrality, subject to restrictions on buybacks, dividends, executive compensation. That was about all we knew, and for the last really 2 weeks since the law was enacted, we've been sort of kind of scratching our heads and trying to imagine what this might look like. One of the main things that Secretary Mnuchin has been saying in all of his appearances on CNBC and the shows and whatnot is that this $454 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot in the scheme of things, is actually going to be used to generate about $2 to $4 trillion in liquidity in terms of what the Fed can do with the help of the Treasury Department. Next slide. So this is what we got this morning. The Federal Reserve this morning, so this is live stuff. This is updated about 2 hours ago. Federal Reserve announced new actions to provide $2.3 trillion in loans. This is not the $2.3 trillion that was in the CARES Act. This is using a small fraction of the money in the CARES Act to provide additional liquidity based on the sort of leverage ratios. It created a PPP liquidity facility that is meant to help as Dave said, there's been a ton of these loans going out the door, about $100 billion already of the $350 billion they have to authorize. This is meant to, as these banks hit their asset limits or are running out of liquidity, this will help them with term financing backed by these PPP loans as collateral. So it'll help banks make these loans. The Main Street Lending Program that I mentioned on the earlier slide, with $75 billion from that $454 billion pot, the Fed is now creating this Main Street lending program, which will run through existing private lenders, and it'll be a program of right now $600 billion to those small and mid-sized businesses, up to and including PPP eligible people, but all the way through the 10,000 employee mark. And actually, there's a revenue threshold as well. It also expanded existing Fed facilities for primary and secondary credit markets, and TALF that's related to mortgage-backed securities. And so that's an additional $850 billion that'll be injected into the credit markets. And then a municipal liquidity facility. This was something that Democrats were fighting for a great deal in the enactment of the CARES Act. They were concerned that states and municipalities that are getting hard hit by the COVID pandemic, they wanted access, or have them to have access to this relief as well. So this creates a liquidity facility for states and municipalities to borrow against. Next slide. So here is the specifications on this Main Street lending program. Now, this is distinct from what I described before. This is not what Congress prescribed. This is the Fed doing its own thing in conjunction with the Treasury. Similar but different in meaningful ways. So the eligibility is you have to have less than 10,000 employees, or less than 2.5 billion in 2019 total revenues. So it is not just capped at 10,000. You actually could have more than 10,000 if you were below that revenue threshold. What it does is, as I said, takes $75 billion in the ESF funds, leverages into about $600 billion in loan purchases. The terms of these loans are consistent. It's a 4-year loan. Principal and interest payments are deferred for 1 year. It is an adjustable rate. It'll be roughly 2.5% to 4%, depending on the overnight rate. A minimum loan size of $1 million, and there's actually technically 2 facilities here. So the maximum loan size depends. If it's a new loan, you'll be capped at the lesser of 25 million, or 4 times your EBITDA. Or for expanded loans, so this would be existing loans that would be augmented, you could borrow up to $150 million, the lesser of $150 million, 30% of your outstanding debt, or 6 times EBITDA. So a significant amount of money, particularly if you have existing and outstanding debts. You can prepay without penalty. The requirements that I mentioned are different in notable ways than were prescribed in the CARES Act. You still have to certify that you'll make a reasonable effort to maintain payroll and retain workers. You are not held to those very prescriptive 90% markers. You do have to deal with the compensation, stock buyback, and dividend restrictions that are there under the CARES Act, but related to, again, those employee retention figures and staying neutral with respect to organizing campaigns are not applicable. And so that's important to some people that were looking at those potential lending programs. And I'll note probably the most important thing here, particularly after hearing Dave's spiel, firms may take out PPP loans and Main Street loans. There's no mutual exclusivity there, and therefore it's not just for people greater than 500 to 10,000. It is for everyone. If this loan program suits you, it is open to you. I think we'll know more on this. There's significant guidance. I mean, among other things, how do you calculate the what are the affiliation rules for this purpose? How do you get to the 10,000 employees? On what basis are you looking at those? We don't know a lot beyond what's on the term sheets. That's at the Federal Reserve website. We will know more about this in the weeks to come, and we expect to have it up and running later in the month. So we can go to the next slide here. Changing gears a little bit, I talked about the tax changes earlier on, but I think these are worth talking about. Again, this was the biggest piece of the bill from a revenue standpoint, about $590 billion. I think the one thing that I'd call the most attention to, just because it's a new provision and something that is eligible for, or everyone is eligible for, to the extent they're not using the PPP program. The Act did create a refundable payroll tax credit of up to 50% of wages. That's capped at $10,000 per employee per quarter. Runs through the end of the year, but it is a significant benefit meant to keep people on payroll. Again, delay of the employer payroll tax, that's basically the government floating you 6.2% for up to 2 years. You have to pay the balance of your 2020 deferral, half of it by the end of 2021, the rest by the end of 2022, but it's a nice little deal there. Modification of NOL rules. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act limited the ability to carry back losses and put them against previous good years. You have a 5-year carryback for 2018, 19, and 20 tax years. So if you had losses that you could utilize, you can now do that. Going back 5 years, they changed the rules with respect to pass-through so that they can also get the same treatment. If you are a corporation with AMT credits related to, again, the pre-TCJA era, this would allow you to accelerate those in the form of refunds. There was a loosening of the interest deduction limitations under, again, the TCJA. Those were set at 30% and are now loosened to 50% of EBITDA. So as you're borrowing and the government's encouraging you to borrow to get through this crisis, they don't want to punish you for doing that. So it makes it a little bit easier. And also, this is important for anyone that is in the retail or restaurant industry, hotels, people that are particularly hard hit at this time. There was finally a fix after almost 3 years to the retail glitch, the QIP fix, which was an error in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that basically took people out of being able to immediately expense their interior improvements to their leasehold leases and that sort of thing. Next slide, Anya. I won't even go through all this, but this is just of those, the $350 billion in health provisions. It's a great deal. There was a lot for, I think Leader Schumer called this the Marshall Plan for hospitals. There's a great deal in here. We're just starting to see how that's being implemented. I know that the funds are just starting to get to the front line. Next slide. And the education provisions, again, it's about $30 billion. I think the most marquee piece of this that you heard a lot about was student loan borrowers getting a 3-month delay on their payments. But there is a lot in here for education, as well as our systems are put on hold and people are doing a lot of remote education. And I know I'm certainly bouncing back and forth between teaching and lobbying. So next slide. what comes next? And I think this is the biggest question. And it depends who you talk to. It depends when you ask, because as I said, about a week ago, we were having a very different discussion. The Democratic Speaker of the House was talking a great deal about infrastructure and green tax credits and some of the other ideas she had for what a future package might hold. And I think as it became apparent that the unemployment numbers in particular were getting worse and worse, I think people realized that talking about the next step and what will come when we go back to work is not the juncture that we're quite at yet. And so the tone has shifted significantly. I think the Senate, and particularly Leader McConnell, was always taking very much a wait and see approach, saying this isn't the time to talk about the next, we should watch what this $2 trillion bill does and the impact it has and see the trajectory of the crisis. The White House has been a little bit all over the place. The president's talked about infrastructure, he's talked about payroll tax cuts. More recently, he's talked about the need to plus up the PPP program. But I do think that the conversation has very much changed. We know there will eventually be a Recovery Act type package. There will have to do something on infrastructure. We'll have to do something on these other issues, but it probably comes late summer at the earliest. And there will probably be a number of packages related to dealing with the immediate crisis, maybe, doing things related to the CARES Act scope at the margin. As I mentioned, Pelosi is now saying she wants to move on what she calls CARES 2. The Senate Democrats are pushing something that would give a big raise to essential workers that are on the front lines of this crisis and help recruit healthcare workers and other critical industries. Phase 3.5 is just my cutesy name for what they're talking about doing in the immediate term, which is, again, plussing up the PPP program. There was an effort to do exactly that today on the floor, and it ended in both sides objecting to each other's plans. The Republicans tried to simply have a bill that would strike the $349 billion from the PPP language and say that we need to have $600 billion. The Senate Democrats countered with a plan that would have something like $500 billion in funding, would add additional funds to the health response, would have $150 billion to the state and local governments, and plus up for SNAP benefits as well, while also within the PPP plan doing more for what they deemed underserved groups like women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and making sure that institutions that lend to those groups have access to PPP funds. It's going to be very interesting to see. Congress is not going to get back until late April at the very earliest. In the Senate, you have a body with 100 members who are overwhelmingly in the high-risk groups for this virus. So I do think that they'll be taking their time coming back, and there will be significant time before we see a bigger package. But happy to take any questions. I think that's the last. What's next, Anya? Is there anything last? Yeah, I think that's just pictures of us. So I think that's the cue for questions, and I'm sure there are many, but I'll turn it back over.
Sure, this is Dave. I think we had a couple of questions about the mechanics of the Paycheck Protection Program. One being about the salary cap, the $100,000 salary cap, and whether that cap applies or how it applies to those employees' benefits. Our understanding based on SBA guidance is that the cap only applies to compensation. So if you have healthcare costs such as payments to continued group benefits, group healthcare benefits, those are also included. Because if you think about it logically, those group benefit costs would probably be the same no matter whether that employee makes $150,000 or $50,000 a year. We had another question about whether employees obtained through like professional organizations, PEOs, or other third parties like that can be counted and included in the loan amount. The answer, according to the SBA, is yes. But an important point to consider is that you will need to obtain payroll documentation for those employees from the PEO or a third party. A related question is whether 1099 employees can be included. And according to SBA guidance, the answer at least as of today, is no. The SBA reasons that independent contractors can, under the CARES Act, seek their own loan under the program. And so I'm assuming they're trying to avoid double dipping. There has been some confusion about that, as there have been with many issues related to this program. But the sort of last word from the SBA has been no. I think there might be a few other questions that Liam might be able to cover.
Yeah, I know. And again, on that slide related, and Anya, can you go back to that the slide that we use the double dipping term, but if you can go back to the one that had some of the interactions there, I just wanted to clarify one or two things, particularly when it comes to the Paycheck Protection Program and increased UI payments. I just want to be clear there that that's conceptual. So the idea is, and the guidance on forgiveness, as Dave I think has said, are still forthcoming. How that exactly will work is not totally clear, but the intent of lawmakers was, as long as you rehire these people that have since gone on unemployment by June 30th, by the end of the covered period, that will not be held against you. And so therefore there's no need to do anything there. You don't have to, the employer's not on the hook for anything related to unemployment. You just have to rehire these workers. And so that directionally, that arrow is just simply, there was an effort to make sure that payroll is maintained and that you're not sort of pulling it at both ends. In terms of, let me see. Kellen, do we have any others that we need to tackle? I'm trying to go through.
Sure. We've had a couple of questions about the EIDL program, people who have applied through that program. Perhaps you guys could just give a status on what people should expect with those applications.
Yeah, so the EIDL program has been, I think, harder to get through to. That is entirely through the SBA, which is itself an overworked agency that does not get nearly the funding it probably needs, especially in a time like this. And so I think with PPP, because it's going through the existing SBA lender network, the ease of getting those and sort of how the logistics that are working, I would imagine are probably flowing a little bit more smoothly despite the hiccups than anything going through SBA right now. I've only heard anecdotally in terms of where people stand with the EIDL loans, but that's just the one bit of color I would give, is that as the PPP is administered through the lending institutions, the EIDL loans are actually going through SBA themselves. And as you can imagine, there's a lot going on. But I have heard of people immediately getting that $10,000 grant. In terms of getting their hands on the actual loan money, I think it's a little bit less clear as to how long that is taking.
Another question is, a couple of people have asked if there is help expected for 501c6 organizations.
Yeah, that's a great question. So just going back into kind of the legislative history of this, the idea was to extend this to not-for-profit institutions. But when you think about what that encompasses, you had to be pretty specific. And so in the law as it is 501c3s, so charitable organizations, and 501c19, so veteran service organizations. And I think that's there for a reason, probably a lot of political reasons. If you think about 501c6s, among others, as much as we love our trade associations and trade association clients, I think there was consideration as to whether that would be somehow subsidizing lobbying or things like that. So I know that's a concern on some sides. I know there's a big advocacy effort by ASAE, the Association of Associations, and individual associations themselves, because particularly at the chapter level, there is a lot of need for this, and this is a sector that employs a lot of people. So I know there's an effort to do that. As to likely near-term changes, I can't really speak to that, but I will say the tricky part is you're dealing with 501c4s that no one will ever go to, C5s, which are labor groups, C7s, which are like country clubs and fraternities. So it's tricky to figure out which of the nonprofit sectors can get this. But I will say that there's a lot of support among the association community to get C6s back in.
A question on the PPP timeline. So this asker is saying that they have some concern about how long the PPP expenses can be covered. So the question is it true that the PPP will only cover expenses for 5 weeks total? And if so, what happens when those 5 weeks expire if a lockdown provision is still in place? So if you have that 5-week window and if it's not extended, how should a business be thinking about that? And then how would it potentially affect loan forgiveness if ultimately after that time has elapsed, they have to make a decision like furloughing employees?
Dave, do you want to take that one? It's 8, to be
Sure.
clear, it's 8 weeks is the period, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, under the existing legislation and guidance, 8 weeks is the period. I think right now there's a push to try to predict what's going to happen in the next 8 weeks, and it's certainly not easy. I suspect that and Liam, you're closer to this than I am, but that part of CARES Plus or Phase 4 could very well be an extension of the sort of the first tranche of paycheck protection legislation, because it really doesn't make sense if after 8 weeks we're still sitting at home and all the employees who you saved through the initial phase three are suddenly unemployed.
Yeah, that's right. I'd echo what Dave said there. I think the good thing about the PPP program is that you have buy-in not only on a bipartisan basis, you have strong champions in the Senate, you have the president on board, and from its earliest moments, this was originally introduced in mid-March, and even then, Senators Rubio and Collins, who were the chief authors, were saying we fully intend to, if this goes past June 30th, because really what they were contemplating was trying to get people through June 30th. And then they were clear even then, if this needs to go further, then we will take it further as to how and when that would work. I think the biggest concern in the immediate term is making sure the current parameters of the program are funded. But I do think there is significant commitment and buy-in on this program and making it work. And I think that increasing that period is absolutely among the things that will be in play, depending on how the trajectory of this crisis plays out.
One thing I do want to note for all listeners is these slides will be available after today's presentation, as well a recording of this webinar. Several people are asking for copies of the slides. Yes, these slides will be made available to you. And there are some questions that have come in asking about specific website URLs and that kind of thing. Your team at Kellen will make those resources available for you. They will be on a special resources website, which I know the Kellen team will tackle at the end of the presentation. I think, guys, we've covered the majority of the questions that have come in. With that, I think we will turn it over to the Kellen team. And of course, I'll keep an eye on the screen to be sure nothing else has come in that needs to be addressed here. And for folks who have submitted things that maybe couldn't be addressed in the presentation, we do have your questions. And I know your folks here will make every effort to get back to you with answers.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. This is Michael Taylor again with Kellen. First and foremost, I want to thank Paul Nathanson, Josh, Liam, David, and the entire Bracewell team for giving us, helping us put together and present to you what I think was a very informative webinar. And I'm sure there is no lack of questions out there. It's just an awful lot of material to absorb, I think, to be able to formulate questions. So with that point in mind, you can see we are putting together a resource page. You see the URL there on the screen. As soon as we end this presentation, it will be live. And once again, just as a reminder to Caitlin's point, there will be a recording of this presentation. There will be other documents there. And also, at the same time, we'll be opening up a resource where you can submit questions, and the Kellen team will review them, attempt to help you with answers and directions. And what we are not able to do or what requires further help in a different form, we will be passing that on to the professionals at Bracewell. And we encourage you to utilize this page and that option as resources. And also, last but not least, I want to thank everybody for attending today, and please stay safe and healthy out there under the circumstances. And thank you again for participating.